Welcome back, everyone, to our next reaction in this series from Extra History on the 30 Years' War. I'm not going to give you any real intro except to say that if you have not seen the first 3 episodes, there's a link in the description, as well as a link to the original video over on Extra Credits. So without any further ado, let's dive right in to part 4.
Electorate of Saxony, November 17th, 1632. Yesterday, Swedish King Gustavus Adolphus clashed with imperial forces under Wallenstein and Pappenheim on the field, fighting in heavy mist. The Protestants emerged victorious. The imperial invasion of Saxony stopped, but at a terrible cost. Pappenheim fell to a cannonball, and King Gustavus, his unit lost in the fog, was surrounded, killed, and his body stripped. 20,000 others lay slain. And today, the men and women of Lützen bury the dead in mass graves. But as terrible as the violence of the field, it's nothing compared to what the two armies have, unwittingly, unleashed upon Saxony.
So my understanding is that Lützen had like half that number of dead. I don't remember reading that there were 20,000 dead from the Battle of Lützen. This is a battle I have studied a little bit about because I remember about 10 years ago, there was actually a big discovery outside of Lützen where they found a mass grave of some of the soldiers from this. In fact, let's go ahead and see if we can look that up real quick. Yeah, so here's an article from archaeology.org where it says here that bioarchaeologists have analyzed 47 skeletons of soldiers killed during the Battle of Lützen, fought November 16, 1632. These soldiers were among the 9,000 killed during the battle and buried in mass graves. The grave was removed. Yeah, they were worried about looting, and so they actually excavated like a 50-ton block of earth and just took the whole thing with the bodies inside to a lab where they could examine it. And they actually found that half of the bodies contained bullet wounds, which was a very high percentage for 1632 for them to have been from bullet wounds. There were some blade wounds, but at least half of them had been wounded by gunfire. They also found some that had unfired lead bullets in their mouths, which was a common thing they would do, is they would hold the bullet in their mouth so they could reload faster. So that's very interesting. There are very few artifacts found in the mass grave. They think the locals took anything of value from the bodies before burying them. So interesting. And also, here's just a picture of the... they put a rock on the spot where the King of Sweden was killed in that battle, and then eventually they built this chapel around that spot. So you can go there today, and hopefully if I get the chance to go to Germany someday, this is a place that I can visit, the spot where Gustavus Adolphus was killed. All right, let's go ahead and back to the video.
Plague. And when he had opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th beast say, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the 4th part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth.
So you can see, we talked about this in the first episode, you can see why people at the time, you have to remember that this is a time when most of Europe is very, very Christian. Most people are going to believe in the God of Christianity. They're going to believe in the Bible. And of course, you know, a lot of them haven't read the Bible for themselves, but they've been taught. And they all have a pretty good idea of the book of Revelation. And you can see how, looking at the events going on in the 30 Years' War, how people could very easily believe that those were the events of the apocalypse of Revelation, you know, talking about a fourth of the earth being wiped out by pestilence or by war or by famine, you know, all these things. And then seeing it happen around you, it would be very easy to think, man, this is it. This is the end of the world.
Thanks so much to Skillshare for helping us tell today's historic tale. We now come to the final element in our exploration of why the 30 Years' War proved to be so destructive: disease. Much like famine, epidemic disease was a common fixture of 17th century life. Even in times without war, local breakouts due to poor sanitation, or even waves of disease brought via trade networks happened periodically. In fact, even before the war, Germany had seen 3 waves of bubonic plague between 1607 and 1611. And with the lack of medical knowledge about the cause and treatment of disease, rates of serious illness and mortality were much higher. And actually, it wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that armies would suffer more deaths in combat than from what were known as camp diseases.
Yeah, in fact, we've talked about this before, but at least I can't speak to all world combat, but at least in terms of the American military, World War II is the first war where the American military had more deaths from combat injuries, from wounds, than from disease on the battlefield. Even in World War I, there were more deaths from disease and accidents than there were from combat wounds.
Because when you rally an army in the 17th century, you draw a large number of people together who are mostly strangers, including some from isolated villages or hamlets that may not have the same immunities as people from urban areas or well-trafficked trade routes. Then add in the often unhygienic conditions of military life, living in tents, open latrine pits, contaminated water sources, and poor or old food, and you have the perfect recipe for gastrointestinal diseases like dysentery. Likewise, a lack of hygiene, inability to change clothes, and the necessity of living close to pack animals, livestock, and cavalry mounts led to outbreaks of lice that carried typhus and bubonic plague. And wherever troops marched, they passed on those diseases to the local population. Now, this was to some extent a normal feature of conflict at the time. But the 30 Years' War added an extra layer with its international nature. For instance, just with the Bohemian Revolt, imperial armies from Germany and Spain marched into Bohemia, bringing in new strains of disease from outside. Then, as the war progressed, the Dutch came, and the Swedish, and the French. But also remember that these national terms don't really mean much, since many of the troops were mercenaries recruited abroad. Scotsmen marched in the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus.
Think about that for a second. Scotsmen in the Swedish army. I love that.
And Italians with the Spanish.
Wow.
Then as the war dragged on, and more forces got involved, the waves of epidemic disease got increasingly deadly. Typhus and dysentery existed at a fairly moderate level throughout the conflict, and a bubonic plague outbreak in 1625 and 1626 tore through both armies and citizenry, killing several prominent generals. Yet it was the Swedish intervention under King Gustavus Adolphus in 1631 when things entered a new phase, both politically and medically. Because there were just more troops, more foreign allies, bigger battles, and increasingly, armies marching through the same area over and over and over. Bubonic plague exploded. It swept the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, depopulating villages as residents tried to flee the mysterious infection, sometimes only to carry it with them to wherever they found sanctuary. Populations displaced by war or military pillaging swelled nearby cities, creating new sanitation crises there that led to more typhus and dysentery outbreaks alongside the plague.
You have to remember that, a lot of these diseases, they still didn't understand what caused them. They really had no idea. I mean, we were starting to understand some of these things at this time, but it's really into the 1800s before we really have a decent understanding of the cause of most of these diseases. And so they weren't doing things, putting, things in place to keep them from spreading, because they really had no idea how to go about doing that. And it just had to have you had to have felt helpless. I mean, as bad as we think things are right now with COVID, it can't even come close to some of the outbreaks that people in the Middle Ages and even in later times felt.
And of course, the widespread famine lowered the immune systems of both soldiers and civilians, exacerbating the spread of disease. Plague began having major strategic consequences. In 1633, a Spanish army struck out from northern Italy, crossing the Alps to attack Rhineland. Instead of battling the enemy, however, it found itself decimated by bubonic plague. 2 years later, a French army would fall to the same fate when invading the Spanish Netherlands, with 17,000 soldiers dying or deserting, due not to the conflict, but camp disease. And Frederick V, who had helped kick off the conflict by accepting the crown of Bohemia from the rebels, died of an unknown infection in 1632, mere weeks after Gustavus died in Lützen. Now, casualty numbers are notoriously difficult to wrestle with when it comes to the 30 Years' War.
Yeah.
They can vary widely depending on what satellite conflicts you include, and local records are often unreliable. But in one study of civilian death records, a staggering 64% of deaths during the war came from bubonic plague. The result, utter devastation.
When you think about the plague, my mind immediately goes to the 1300s. That was when bubonic plague broke out and killed somewhere between a third and a half of the entire European population. That's when England, for example, was just decimated by plague during the reign of Edward III. But you don't think that often of the 1600s. This is the time when the Western Hemisphere is being settled. This is when the American colonies are coming into being. This is 25 years after the settling of Jamestown. This is 13 years after the first settling of Plymouth. And by this point, thousands and thousands of people have come to places like Massachusetts and Virginia. This is when Spain is colonizing in South America and Central America. You don't think about the fact that while all that's going on, plague and war are ravaging Central Europe.
Frankfurt, May 7th, 1636. Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel and Surrey, is an Englishman in a strange country. A diplomat under orders from King Charles I. He's likely beginning to wonder who it is exactly he's supposed to be talking to. On their boat trip along the main river to Frankfurt, his party passed numerous burned towns and castles ruined from siege. Changing to carriages at Frankfurt and hiring musketeers for protection, they strike south into rough country, hearing cannon fire over the horizon. It's nearly dark when they enter the village. Its name, he notices, translates to New Church. And there is a church, as well as several houses, one that's on fire. They call out announcing their presence, but no one answers. Faraway shots echo in the darkening trees. With the sun going down and the nearest town 4 miles away, they decide to stay the night. Their musketeers patrol in the suffocating dark, and Howard's servants cook his meals over timbers dragged from the burning house. Then, after a very tense evening, at first light, they start to investigate. The houses are all empty.
Nobody there.
Not a soul remaining. Then, Howard himself goes to the small church and opens its double doors. The interior is ransacked, its altar and sacred images torn and defiled, and when he steps out into the churchyard, he sees a body scraped out of its grave by scavengers. Whether beasts or human ones, he cannot guess. Another body lies outside the fence. They hurry on, and
Put yourself in this guy's shoes for a second. Okay, he comes from England. So he's crossed the channel, he's come to Europe, he's come to Germany, he's in Frankfurt now, and he's walking around. What must be going through your mind when you enter into a town like that and it's empty, it's deserted, you see bodies lying around, you see things ransacked, and there's nobody there. I mean, your mind must go in 1,000 directions, wondering what happened and wondering whether you're safe in this situation.
it's only at their next stop that they learn the tale. It was not war that killed the village. It was plague. One family had succumbed, and rather than risk infection, the villagers had fled, stopping only to torch the affected house so travelers would not catch the disease. While Howard's account, or rather the account of his secretary, is unique in its texture and detail, the event itself was not uncommon. Things like it happened all over the Holy Roman Empire as the panic set in. And that panic, as panics often do, went to strange places. Some manifested as apocalyptic beliefs, or through deep racism and violence towards foreigners or outsiders. A rash of witch hunting broke out in the empire, mostly centered in places that, ironically, had been the least affected by the conflict.
So when you don't understand why something's happening, and when you can't control it or stop it, you will start to get desperate for answers, desperate for some solution, even if it doesn't make sense. This happens all throughout history. A perfect example of this that has nothing to do with this situation is look in 1930s in Germany. How desperate the situation gets in Germany to where they're just hoping for anybody who can do something to fix their economic situation. And so they turn to the people like the Nazis. Same thing here. You don't know who to blame. You don't know what's the cause. You want to blame somebody, so you start accusing people of witchcraft. That must be the solution. It seems silly to us now, but to them at the time, it was as good as any reason.
Because the people on the front line of the misfortune and tragedy were generally too exhausted for the labor and energy-intensive campaigns of trials, burnings, and hangings. But those eaten up by anxiety about what could happen tomorrow channeled that fear into religious panic and violence. Yet it was not just the civilians living in the empire who were exhausted. After 3 decades of conflict, most of the participating nations were also running on empty. Many participants had expanded their military might, drained their treasuries, and had been forced to put down revolts over increased taxes at home. Spain was broke, France was too, and in England, the financial burdens of the war and Charles's attempt to boost the treasury without calling Parliament helped lead Great Britain into civil war. Plus, almost none of the political players who started the conflict were even still alive, and the whole conception about the war had shifted. While it had begun as a political-religious conflict, when Catholic France entered the fray on the side of the Protestant states, it quickly changed into a war about trying to counter and contain Habsburg power in Europe. And crucially, by the mid-1640s, the war had reached an equitable stalemate. Now, there had been numerous times, after the Bohemian Revolt died, after the Dutch were knocked out, or when Saxony made peace with Ferdinand, when the powers could have just said, "Enough's enough," and ended the slaughter. But at each point, one side was always just in too good of a position. Better to keep throwing troops into the meat grinder and make up for what's been lost.
So, yeah, they call that the sunk cost fallacy. The idea that, well, we've invested so much already, we can't let this be for nothing. And so you keep pouring more and more into a lost cause situation, thinking that somehow you'll get to a place where you'll justify the losses, but you're just adding more losses and more losses to the situation. And to address something else he said, the nature of the reasons for a conflict often change as those conflicts progress and as war aims can change. The American Civil War is a perfect example of that. Lincoln goes to war to preserve the Union, but as the war goes on, it becomes increasingly about not only preserving the Union, but also an opportunity to eliminate slavery once and for all. And so that happens. War aims change as new participants join, as the war goes on and the situation changes. That's not an uncommon thing at all. One thing I will say, and I don't know how much more is left of this video, so maybe I'll wait until the end.
But now, everyone had a slice of the pie. Everyone had a negotiating position. By 1648, the Four Horsemen had run their course, and it was time, finally, to make peace, to draft a treaty at Westphalia.
So that's a big deal, and we'll talk about that in the next episode. One thing I will say, while I always love how Extra History tells a story, and they do a good job of kind of getting down at the micro level and looking at the stories, like the story of Thomas Howard in this one. It's a great way of seeing these conflicts from a new direction. I will say in this case, I feel like there's so much, and I like the spin, the focus on the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. I feel like having watched this hasn't given me a good understanding about the overall history of what happened in the 30 Years' War. So we'll see what happens in the next episode. But once we get through this, we might take a look at someone else's series on this to maybe get a better understanding at the macro level, kind of the bird's eye view of what's happening with the different nations and why they get involved and where the battles are and all that sort of thing, to kind of couple with this view, which I love, but I think we need more. So we'll see. If you have suggestions on a video to do that, I'm all ears for that. All right. Thanks for watching, and we will see you again tomorrow with the next episode.